So, hello everyone. We're here today with Tom Hoeler, and he is an editor at Random House Worlds. He works primarily on all of the Star Wars books, I believe. And so, I'd love if you could tell me a little bit about how you first became a Star Wars fan.
Sure. And thank you for inviting me to chat today. It's really exciting. How I first became a Star Wars fan. Oh gosh. It's unfortunately a very difficult question for me to ask because I can't remember the first time I ever saw Star Wars. Like I meet so many people and I talk to them about like, oh, the first time they saw Star Wars is like such a, or were exposed to Star Wars like such a, a pivotal moment for them in their lives. And unfortunately for me, I just can't remember it. So I usually like to just say, well, Star Wars has always been with me. Since I can't remember the first time, I was simply born knowing Star Wars, which is, not true. But anyway, I first became a Star Wars fan, watching the movies at home on, at that point, VHS. I'm a child of the late 80s into the 90s, so, VHS being a big thing. And having the VHSs and just watching them over and over. And at one point, my family moved and we lost our copies
Oh,
of A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back just like disappeared. I don't know what happened to them, just don't know. They ended up in a box that just fell off the truck on the way to the new house or whatever. And so for a little while when I was really young, the only movie that I had access to that I could watch repeatedly, unless the movies were like on TV, was Return of the Jedi. So like I saw Return of the Jedi probably like 10 times the amount of times that I saw the other movies, just because for a while it was the only one I could find. But then it was a really big moment for me as a Star Wars fan when the special editions came out and the movies were re-released into theaters, because that was my first experience getting to see Star Wars in a movie theater, big screen. And it's around that time too that I was starting to come into my own as far as making decisions about what I wanted to read as a kid and then as a young person. And I found Star Wars books around that time, and then really just fully fell head first, into the deep end of all things Star Wars between books and comics and films and video games. And it was really like off to the races from there. But yeah, it started with that one VHS that somehow made it through our move, and then getting to see Star Wars on the big screen for the first time um,
so
during the
a lot of
90s.
those like early comics that you picked up, does anything come to mind when that you read as a young child, you know?
Um, so for the comics, it was one of those things, and this was often my comics experience, whether we're talking about Star Wars or like Spider-Man or Batman, whatever. It's just I did not have someone or really something to direct me where to go. So I'm fairly certain that like my first Star Wars comic was just like I just like was at the comic book store and like saw a comic that looked really cool. I can't even remember what it was. It was just like I'm gonna read that one, fairly certain that that was like the middle of a run, was not the
Yeah.
beginning of something. And again, it was the same way. Like my first Spider-Man comic, I think, was like the middle part of like a six-part series involving Venom or something. Because again, the cover just looked awesome. So a lot of the early comics may sort of bleed together. Because I just can't quite recall like which ones were which. My first Star Wars novel, though, I can explicitly recall because I was in a bookstore and it was in the section of all Star Wars books, and I picked out the book to me that just looked most interesting in terms of the cover and the title. And that book was a novel by Michael Stackpole called I, Jedi. And I
Yeah.
remember picking it out. And again, I did not have someone being like, "Hey, if you want to get into Star Wars books, like this is where you would start." And obviously at the time in like the late 90s and whatever, it's not like there were hundreds of books anyway, but certainly there were enough that you might get recommendations. So I didn't have someone being like, "Hey, here's Heir to the Empire. Here's, Rogue Squadron." So I was just in the store or library, but fair service store, and saw this book. And the fact that the title was I, Jedi was like really strange to me. It was the title that stood out the most among all the other titles. And then I looked at the cover of it and I was just like, I don't recognize this person from a Star Wars movie. And I opened it and I realized it was in first person. I was like, oh my God, this is like a person who's a Jedi. Cool. I'm gonna read this. And I read it. That was my first Star Wars book. Uh, and again, it was just because it was entirely a self-directed thing. And then
Right.
once I did that, I then had access to like the little timeline in the front, and sort of then started to actually do the research of the research you could at the time without, without Wikipedia or the internet really being what it
What
was.
other books were out there, basically?
Exactly. To then figure it out and then made my way to like Heir to the Empire and the other things. And then eventually caught up to the point that I then became a reader who was just like,
Every
what
time
books are
something came
these?
out, you, yeah.
Exactly. So I made my way there eventually. By the time I got into like late middle school and early high school, but before that, it was just kind of like, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna read everything, and I'm just gonna go in what directions I want. I definitely did not read optimally, but you know what? Worked out totally great because
It
I
did.
again loved it. Um,
So back then it was Del Rey instead of Random House World. So what was your first project working for Del Rey?
my first project working for Del Rey. So I started full time in fall of 2014. In fact, my first day working for Del Rey full time is the same day that Star Wars: A New Dawn published. So me and the canon novels have the exact same birthday, work birthday. But my first actual project in Star Wars, a couple of years before that, I was a summer intern for Del Rey, and I got to work on a number of different projects. I got to contribute to a number of different things. But my first project is actually kind of two projects. One is this if anybody ever went to Star Wars Celebration in 2012, I believe it was in Orlando, Florida. I unfortunately was not there. There was this giant poster that was given out. I believe there were signings for that was like all the Star Wars novels at the time in this like long sort of like timeline arrangement. And that was one of my projects for the summer was helping to design that poster. But then the first real book project that I really got to sink into and provide stuff on is the Essentials Reader's Companion, which is right here over my shoulder, which was for folks who aren't familiar, is a unique encyclopedia in terms of Star Wars books. It's an encyclopedia of like all of the books and novels and some of the larger comic series and a kind of a deep dive timeline look into like what happens in each book, how the books are arranged across the different the different eras of Star Wars, and has tons of original art of characters and scenes from the book. And so I got to help contribute to that by doing a bunch of research for the artists. So when the artists were sitting down to draw a character, many of whom had never been depicted for this book, I would go through every appearance that character had and put together like a two-page breakdown of like, here's all the books they've appeared in, here's some paragraph excerpts of like their physical description or what they're wearing or what the species looks like. I did the same for the scenes, and then I helped do a lot of the indexing for the book and making sure that there are two indexes and making sure the indexes were put together. So that was the first book I really got to contribute to in a big way. And then once I started full time, is contributing to basically every Star Wars novel that's been published since, fall 2024. It's 2014, excuse me. It is 2024. So that was the first project. And a couple of the novels around then I got to like read and provide some like early feedback on. But this one was probably the one that I
The
got to
biggest
work on
one.
the most. It would count it as my first project.
I know on
Also, yeah.
Wikipedia we use Essential Reader's Companion a lot because of the timeline. So it's kind of like the early version of Timelines,
It,
the reference novel. So
Very much so. It was very cool to work on. Also, it's really exciting because I worked on it in the summer. It did not come out until the fall of that particular year. And I remember I went to the bookstore. I was still in graduate school, and I went to the bookstore to go get it the day that it came out. And I went with a couple of my classmates. I was like, "Hey, this book that I got to work on for the summer is coming out. I want to go get it." And when I went to get it and I opened the back, I did not know that Pablo had been generous enough, because Pablo Hidalgo is the author, had been generous enough to put my name in the acknowledgments. And so I got to find it like in the middle of this, I think it was a Borders bookstore, which doesn't exist anymore. Find this, my name in the acknowledgments of a Star Wars book for the first time, which was really cool. And like showing all my classmates who were very kind to me, but I don't think that they cared as much as I
it
did.
means a lot more to like a Star Wars super fan. He's like, my name is in this book.
Yeah. So very
Yeah,
cool.
sure. We actually have a little bit of trivia on your Wikipedia article about some of the early work you did for the Aftermath books about like creating all of those Huttese phrases, which I think was interesting.
I did. That was in particular for the third book in the series for Empire's End. Chuck Wendig, who is the author, was putting together some conversations in Huttese and even a song in Huttese. And I distinctly remember writing him an email by being like, "Give me an hour," and wrote and went through and compiled as much of the Huttese as I could, and then extrapolated out some phrases for words that simply at the time there just wasn't one. There wasn't a Huttese word um, for something like someone who's a cheater, like a cheater at cards or something. There just like wasn't a word for that. So I was just helped to come up with that and make suggestions and work through it. So yeah, it was like an early, very strange request
And I
from
guess
an
that
author.
would have been one of your earlier works as well, the Aftermath just series. So I'm a big
Definitely,
fan
those
of those. So
were yeah, that was because those
Tw-
books started coming out in 2015, so that was just
Yeah.
over a year after I'd started working. So yeah, that was early on as well.
So, in recent years, we've also had the opportunity to enjoy like from a certain point of view, but those have so many authors. Um, how did the idea come about for having so many authors working on one project?
Oh, this is one of my favorite stories to tell, because it is probably really indicative of the kinds of ways in which the very best projects come about. We refer to this project as the best bad idea ever, which is that we were all sitting around starting to think about the 40th anniversary of Star Wars for 2017. My gosh, we're already like, 2027 is like 3 years from now. The 50th, we were thinking about the 40th anniversary of Star Wars. And as a big anniversary, always think about, oh, is there a special project that we could do that would help us celebrate the anniversary beyond, in a really cool way. And so we were sitting around thinking about like, well, what would we do for the 40th anniversary of Star Wars? And we were throwing out every possible idea imaginable, everything from very simple things like, oh, we could re-release the original novelization with like a brand new cover or in some fancy version of it, all the way up to like very extravagant, kind of ridiculous ideas. We're having this brainstorm. And someone was like, well, what if we found a different way to tell the story of the original Star Wars film? Not change the story of it, but tell it from a different perspective. Just find another way for people to experience that story, even if you've already experienced it, 100 times. And then somebody was like, yeah, and what if we did it from the point of view of the side characters, from not the main heroes, from not characters like Luke and Leia? Essentially, if what if we just push the POV to other characters in the scenes? Because one of the things that all of us, I think, love so much about Star Wars is how much of a lived-in place it is, and how at the margins of every single frame of every TV show and every movie and everything, there are just all of these amazing characters and people, and you're just like, what is that person's story over there and that person's story over there? And so we decided to like take that idea to the nth degree, which is let's tell the whole movie from the point of view of side characters. And actually, the original iteration of FactBuff is we were going to hire a single person to do that. And then we thought, and somebody was like, well, it's 40 years. So what if we told the movie in 40 stories? And then somebody else took that a step further and says, yeah. And this was actually originally a joke. They were like, yeah, 40, we should hire 40 different people to do that. And everybody laughed because it's a ridiculous suggestion, because that is so much work, that is so much
Yeah.
complexity. And making a book of any kind, Star Wars or others, like publishing is complex enough. So making a book with 40 different moving parts, 40 different authors, is super complex. So we all laughed, and it was this big joke. And then we all looked at each other in the meeting, and we were like, darn it,
Maybe it would
that's
work.
it. That's it. We have to do it now. Now we have to do it. We've all got this idea in our head. It's going to be ridiculous. It's going to be super challenging. We don't really know how to do it, but this sounds so correct. We just have to. So we ran with it and we figured out how to do it as hard as it was. And we ended up with Star Wars from a certain point of view. 40 years, 40 stories. It just rolled off the tongue after that. So it was the perfect project.
So, finding which characters to include and which not, did you just watch the movie as a group and just pick, or
So we started with that. So what we did was we started by watching the movie and we took like the broadest survey of just like how many side characters are there? I mean, the answer is a ton, but just like kind of looking around like, okay, in every single scene, we sort of broke down like who are the side characters, or at least who are the non-main characters. We established it's like Han, Luke, and Leia and Vader are all definitely off limits, and then there's some wiggle room, but definitely them, so everybody else. And we made this big list. But ultimately, and something that was really important to us in bringing people onto the project, because we had 40 people, is we really wanted the authors to drive what characters and what kinds of stories and thus what POVs we got as much as possible. So we made this big survey, but that survey really served mostly as an aid for the author, for authors to pick a characters. Because some people we would go to and say, hey, we'd love to have you participate. And they'd be like, oh, I immediately have an idea for what kind of character I want to use. And then great.
right?
And we'd go off. Some people, though, and particularly as the project started to fill up, people would be like, well, is there someone who hasn't been taken, or can you help me brainstorm? Because we're always helping authors brainstorm ideas. And so we use this survey as kind of that tool. It also helped us keep in mind like how balanced is the film? Like if we decide to do all side POVs, is there a moment in the movie where there just aren't any? And luckily,
Right.
A New Hope is like a remarkably balanced film. There are side characters in every scene pretty much all the time, with like one exception. Um, the Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi are not like that, which presented their own challenges when we got to those books. So we did survey the film, but it was not so much like we handed people a list of 40 characters and said, pick one of these 40. We
Right.
really gave room for folks to find the character or find the type of story they wanted to tell and then match those things if they needed help doing that.
And then also make sure there wasn't a ton of characters at the front half of the film versus back half of the film. It was really even spread from what I saw.
Exactly. And you know, you're always gonna, it's almost impossible not to over-index ever so slightly when you have things like the cantina scene when there are a million characters. But you're correct that we wanted to make sure that the book as a whole told the entire story of the film. And we weren't just doing 40 short stories, but only getting, you know, halfway through the movie. So yeah, there was also that sense of making sure that we knew we could make recommendations to provide some balance. And there was this thing where once an area of the film filled up, we would start to nudge authors who hadn't, you know, chosen the character yet towards parts of the film that were
Film.
not as dense. So that again, we didn't end up with 40 Cantina stories. 40 Cantina stories would have been amazing,
We
but that
actually
wasn't
have most
exactly
of
the
the
goal.
people written,
Yeah,
completed on Wookieepedia that are in the cantina. So it
yeah.
was
And that would
sweet.
be a great book in and of itself, but that obviously wasn't really the goal for
Of
From a
course,
Certain
of
Review, is
course.
to get the view of the entire movie. Um,
Um, So a lot of the work that you have worked on, they're just the standard adult novels, but we've also seen a lot of audio dramas come out recently, which is a really unique thing to have a full cast. The first one was Duke of Jedi Lost, and then how does the editing process differ between an audio drama and a novel?
It differs quite a bit because you're kind of flexing different storytelling muscles than a prose novel. Um, so the first thing to remember is that like the project is going to exist as an audio experience first. It is, you know, it is an audio original, it's an audio forward project. And you know that's evidenced by the fact that we release them in audio first, and then the printed and digital script books follow later. The second thing is that we're not writing prose; we are writing a script, similar to as if we were making a movie or a TV show. An audio script is kind of like that, or like a play. And because of that, you have different tools at your disposal to execute different elements of a story. And so the maybe one of the best ways in which that manifests is like, let's say you have a character who like is having a conversation with someone and wants to walk across the room, grab something off of a shelf, walk back across the room and hand that item to somebody. Well, if you're writing a prose novel, that's just about a paragraph or two of the dialogue is continuing, and you can talk about how Obi-Wan walked across the room and picked up the holocron and walked back. You know, very simple, right? You just sort
Right.
of are relying on description and dialogue, and you're gonna layer those things together so that you get the sense of a character moving and talking at the same time, and that's it for a prose novel. But for an audio drama, people, because you do not have the same amount of words, because you are relying so much on sound and so much on dialogue to carry the story, that same sort of situation would have to be executed much differently. You would actually have to rely on dialogue to set up action, and then you would rely more on things like sound effects to execute that action. So, you know, Obi-Wan might, in that same situation, you might have, he might say, oh, the holocron we need is just over there. I'm going to grab it. And then you'd have like FX that would be pitter pitter, you know, pitter patter of feet, and the dialogue could continue. And then Obi-Wan might be like, you know, pitter patter of feet as he's walking back. And then you might have dialogue where he's just like, here, take this. And if you think about it, like some of that dialogue and some of those things would not appear if it was a prose novel, but you're relying on different strengths.
Different.
And the audio format has different strengths, which are amazing. The FX, the use of sound, the ability to bring an amazing musical cue in right when someone is making like an inspiring speech, or, you know, just before they draw their lightsaber. Um, so
The
it's
lightsaber
very
sound
different.
effects are amazing.
Yeah,
You
I
just
love
hear
them.
it.
So all of those things are just tremendously different from when we're designing a prose novel, but it just means that we can tell different stories than we tell in prose novels. And also, when we're exploring a story, we can think about what things can we do with sound effects, with dialogue, with music that'll enhance this in a way that even if you were reading, let's say, just the audiobook version of a prose novel, it wouldn't be the same experience. It's been really fun, and it's really cool to be able to kind of explore telling Star Wars stories in a slightly different space, and in a slightly different way that hopefully is as exciting as anything else, but also is unique in the way that a book is unique from a comic, and a comic is unique from a TV show, etc. You know, they all have these interesting strengths that you can do cool things with. Audio drama is the same way.
And they all tie into the novels as well. I've noticed that a lot of the audio dramas, they tie into whatever novels are releasing around the same time. And it's amazing to find those connections. So,
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, we treat them like every other book we do, which is that they are part of the same large tapestry of Star Wars stories. And so we want the same level of immersion and connectivity to the rest of the stories that we're telling, meaning, you know, whether that's characters or events or, you know, moments within the same part of the timeline. We think about them and treat them exactly the same way, even if when you open the pages to one of the script books, you know, the text is all center justified and it's not written out in paragraphs. Doesn't matter to us. It's still a Star Wars story, and we still approach it the exact same way, conceptually.
yeah. So, kind of leading into the next question, something really important in literature in general is being able to connect with like a character's internal voice. Because, um, so what's your process for helping an author have their protagonist voice shine through and like get through to readers to make them feel something?
Oh, wow, that's a big question.
I
So,
know.
there's a couple things. The first thing is that ideally this kind of thing starts before the author ever puts, well, finger to keystroke, I guess, but you know, pen to paper, which is to sit down and say, what's the goal of this character? Like, what's their journey? What are they trying to accomplish? What stands in their way? And what is their arc over the course of a story going to look like? How close or how far away from that goal are they going to get? And what kinds of things are they going to, what kind of impediments are they going to face? What kind of allies or people who are going to help or things that are going to help are going to meet? And in doing that and in identifying all of that, you can then help the author identify, basically it helps inform, like, how does this character speak, how do they sound, like what's the level of conviction in their voice or in their dialogue, what's the way in which they present themselves, both in terms of their posture but also in terms of their interior monologue. And it's really about digging down to figure out what does the character need and what does the character want, and at every moment of the story, how close or how far away are they from that thing, and at every moment in the story with each new development, how much closer or how much further are they getting. And when you have that kind of clarity, and when you put that kind of clarity in a story, and when the author has that kind of clarity in their own mind as they're writing the character, that actually is what helps them find the character's voice most of all. And that is true whether we're talking about like a brand new original character who's never appeared before, or whether you're writing another Princess Leia or Han Solo story. The stories and times in which you might read a line and be like, oh, that doesn't sound like Han Solo, is often because there's some lack of clarity around what the character needs at that moment that they're trying to get. There are also mechanical things, like there are just certain words that you're just like, Han Solo doesn't say that word, or Princess Leia doesn't talk like that, right? In terms of words or attitude or sort of way of speaking. But a lot of it just comes down to knowing what the character needs or wants from scene to scene, and then figuring out how they vocalize that or how they verbalize that. And it just comes from talking. The process of being an editor, almost more than anything else, in fact, more than revising a book for errors or for ways to improve it, is about creating a conversation with an author about their text and using that conversation to interrogate and ask questions and probe at different parts of the text, whether it's the plot, the characters, the themes, and through that conversation, elicit like the best version of all those things from the author, and then that's how the author then creates the best work from it. It's this constant conversation with them. So that's kind of how you do it. It sounds a little amorphous, I know, but that's partially because like
No,
editing
I
is
love to hear
not,
about it.
yeah,
It's
it's
complex.
not
It's very
this,
complex.
exactly. It's not this like press these five buttons and then you have edited kind of thing. It doesn't work that way. It's mostly about conversations, and it's mostly about asking like, "Ooh, why'd you write it this way? What are you trying to accomplish?" And then when they tell you, say, "Oh, interesting. Here's what I got from that. If this is what you're trying to accomplish, this might be a way to get to that in a different way." And you just keep going and going and going, almost like you're honing away until like the statue or the thing reveals itself. So you just kind of keep doing that over and over and over again. and then eventually one of you says, okay, we have to stop, because that's obviously also a process that could continue forever.
Ever,
Um,
yeah.
and so part of the process of finding a character's voice and making sure that a voice is shining is that, like, once you see that happening, you stop. You're like, this probably could be made 1% better, but also every time you make it 1%
Is
better,
that
you could
better?
also make it 5% worse, right? And at some point, you're like, okay, we're good. We move on.
Um, Delilah was talking in an interview recently about your work on Rise of the Red Blade and how it was really important to get Iskat's voice to show through because nobody knew who she was. So she wasn't a Han or a Leia or anyone that we would know. So I think for minor characters, it could be especially important to try to develop that like internal voice.
You're
Um,
you're you're 100% right, and that for Delilah Dawson, for those who don't know, the author of Inquisitor: Rise of the Red Blade, she's totally right, and it is this extra challenge of when you have a character on the page who has never appeared in TV show or a movie or a video game. There's a lot of extra work, particularly early on in a book, that you need to do to really get people to connect with them and get people to understand the character's voice, more so than you need characters like, let's say, Han or Leia, because for the most part, when someone reads something that Han or Leia or Luke or a lot of the characters like that say, you kind of instantly, I mean, everyone who's ever seen Star Wars, like you kind of instantly have that, oh, that does sound like them, or that doesn't sound like it, sounds authentic or not. But you're right, and for Iskat, that was a real challenge of when you have an original character, you don't immediately as a reader have that understanding. You're trying to learn that. And it was particularly important for that book. It's a great example because in that book, Isket is standing next to characters who you know how they speak. She is standing next to Mace Windu and Yoda and Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. And so there's almost even more importance for an original character to have clarity of voice in a story like that, because you need them to stand next to the legacy Star Wars characters and feel like they belong, like feel like they
there.
fit seamlessly in that tapestry and don't stick out as this weird outlier who doesn't fit into the conversation. So there's almost an added challenge when you're doing something like that with an original character, because
And it
you
did
have to
tie into
believe them.
Anakin's knighting ceremony as well. So that was an interesting thing.
It was that was fun. It was fun to be able to show something we had already seen from someone who's also in that scene, but they are, having a vastly
Different.
different experience of that scene than Anakin was, even if they're, like I think she's standing like a row in front of him or maybe just to his right or something like that. They're pretty close together, and yet the way that that scene plays out for the two of them is actually pretty wildly different.
Yeah. So out of the works you've been involved with, do you have a favorite Star Wars book or cover?
Um, so I don't have a favorite Star Wars book, and the reason is, um, it is hard when I think about all of the books that I worked on. It is hard to separate, like, the stories that I like are like, oh, this character is really cool, I really enjoyed it, from like the kind of total experience of working on that book, the relationship that I have with the author and the person who helped create that book and the process of making it. So it's very hard to pick a favorite book because it's like being asked to pick a favorite friend or family member or something. So I sort of don't do that. What I usually tell people is that my favorite book is whatever book I'm working on right now, or whatever book like I just finished, and then whatever book I start up next, that becomes my favorite book because that is just the only way I can kind of think of it. So, The Living Force by John Jackson Miller, which comes out about 3 weeks after this interview is being made. It's the 19th of March right now, and Temptation of the Force by Tessa Gratton are two projects that we've most recently sort of finished up and put together. So those are my favorite books right now. Um, but there are some other things that are going to be my favorite books very soon, that folks maybe will learn about in the future at some point. Because, always working on new things. But that's how I think of my favorites. In terms of covers, gosh, again, a lot of different covers pop out. The cover for The Living Force by Oliver Cuthbertson, like that cover is beautiful and amazing, as you can see right over my shoulder. Um, it's one of my favorites because the challenge we put in front of Oliver was pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but it was actually pretty daunting, which is we would love for you to create a cover that both A, evokes the kind of mood and style of like the Phantom Menace and like the kind of art styles we saw for that movie in book covers and in movie posters. But also, by the way, you need to fit 12 Jedi Masters onto one book cover, which is not easy to do. Like to fit 12 characters onto a cover is a really big challenge. And he was just like, "That's fine, got it." And honestly, from the very first sketch basically looked like this just without any color on it. Like he just nailed it from the beginning. So I think I really love that cover because of how well it came together and because of how much he accomplished, and the fact that I look at that cover and I think about, like, it makes me feel like it's 1999 again. Like it really does. It makes me feel like the era of the Phantom Menace, which is
Mhm.
exactly I think what that book's supposed to do and that cover's supposed to do. Um, but man, I love a lot of our book covers, and in no small part because I think if anyone goes and looks at the book covers for the books that we've published over the last 10 years, we've almost never published the same book cover twice. Obviously, within certain series or trilogies, there are covers that are meant to be cohesive with each other, like the Alphabet Squadron books or, the High Republic books or Aftermath trilogy. There's obviously meant to be some cohesion there or iteration because, of course, it's a series. But really, from book to book, all of the different styles that the team has employed and all of the different artists, it's really exciting. And I have so enjoyed how at the beginning of each book, we sit down and talk about like the core elements of that book in terms of the mood, the emotion, the themes, the era, the characters. And then we all like, let's figure out the artist and the art style that's going to work for this rather than trying to say, well, it's a Star Wars book and we haven't made a green Star Wars book cover in a while, so make a
We
green
should
Star
make
Wars
it,
book cover,
yeah.
right? Like we don't, that's not the way that we do it. And it's really tremendously exciting to get to sort of reinvent it every time in a way that fits each book, but still, feels correct.
And how the celebration covers are all a very unique treat most of the time.
Oh yeah, I mean the con edition covers too are also, celebration or other convention edition covers are really special. I think because we get to be unmoored a little bit from some of the basic rules of making book covers. Like
Yes.
obviously, if you go to a bookstore, every book cover has text on the front of it, by and large, right? Because you're trying to tell people about a book, and so you need to put things like the author's name and the title of the book and information that tells people what a book is. But for these special one-offs, we obviously still have authors' names on spines. We still obviously have book titles and things, but it opens up opportunities to do some special stuff with the covers and to do more full bleed images and scenes and things that just honestly would not be possible in under like the normal formatting that we work. So yeah, a lot of those convention editions are really cool. I think about those very special editions of the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy that we did that
Yes.
came in the slip cases that had Thrawn like they were styled as if they were almost like Napoleon era paintings of Thrawn and his very fine chiss attire and how he got to progress those. Those were done by Magali Villeneuve, if anyone's looking those up. Those three covers were so much fun to make, and just came out so I think like captured the essence of that character, particularly in his younger days, in such a specific way that I'm always going to be pretty fond. I think of those as well.
I don't know if you remember working on it, but my favorite was the Master and Apprentice cover from 2019. It has like Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon just like back to back. So
Yes, it's very it's not quite abstract, but it is that's from Jama Jurabev is the artist who did that cover. That was for Celebration 2019. He's actually done a lot of our special edition covers. Jama has
yeah.
done special covers for us all over the place. He's phenomenal. And yeah, that cover is slightly like abstract, two Jedi kind of in the rain, or it looks like they're kind of in the rain facing off against a faceless army. Really stylistic and cool. I really that's a great cover. That's a fantastic cover.
Although
Which yeah, which you
speak
can see on Wikipedia, by the way. If you look up the entry for Master and Apprentice or any of these books, the
yes.
cover arts are there if you're looking at like what the various editions look like.
I've written most of the Master and Apprentice related articles.
There you go.
It,
See,
it's used
so
on pretty much all of my articles. So
so you know it's
uh,
right, people who are watching this. You know
yeah.
it's correct.
So speaking of new books, so Living Force is coming out soon. If you had to describe the book in one word, what would it be?
I have been agonizing about this question for a while now, mostly because thinking describing a book in any book in one word is really hard. Um, I'm gonna cheat, and I'm gonna pick individual words, but I'm not gonna pick just one. So one word, um, oddly enough, friendship. Um, this book is about a lot of different characters. There's a lot of Jedi, obviously, the entire Jedi Council, as well as some other characters, including Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn. Um, And it is a story that definitely explores the friendship and relationships between all of these different characters and what friendship means for Jedi, what friendship means for other people, what friendship means for people for between Jedi and other Jedi or Jedi and non-Jedi. It just explores relationships and friendships quite a bit. It's also um, fun and funny, which is really kind of important. And in fact, there's a few moments in this book that I would actually describe as silly, and I mean that in the best way possible. Because I think one of the important things about looking at a Jedi story, particularly at this moment, is it's a year before the Phantom Menace. So it's a year before the prequel trilogy, and we know that the experience of the Jedi Order over the course of the prequel trilogy through to the end of Revenge of the Sith is really not great, right? The sort of order gets, deteriorates in various ways, and it is not a happy time by and large, right? There are moments of happiness, there are obviously moments of joy, there are still moments of friendship and all these things, but it's a real transitional moment. It's a real moment of turmoil. And so looking at the Jedi before all of that happens, the deep breath before the plunge, to quote a wizard from a different franchise, the deep breath before the plunge, the sort of year before, means getting to see the Jedi Council at this moment where things are still very important. They still have important duties. There are still dangers. There are still, stakes and obligations for them. But there are also these moments where, like, you get to see the Jedi Council members, some of them being a little silly in a way that I don't think you ever really get to. And I think it was really important for John in exploring this story to really explore the Jedi Council members not just as Jedi and not just as like this group of people who are leading the Jedi Order, but also as individuals and as people. And being silly and having fun is part of the experience of being a person. And I was some of the parts of the book that I found the most surprising were these moments where I was just laughing so hard while editing the book because of some of the funny stuff that is going on that still feels natural within the course of the rest of
Right.
the story. Um, uh, and then the last part is the last word is history, because the other special thing about the Living Force is that it is a book that gets to reckon with the Jedi's history in a way that we haven't really been able to do before. And a lot of that is a gift that has been given to us by the existence now of something like the High Republic. So a story that is set just before the Phantom Menace, when you want a character like Yoda or Yaddle, or even a character who's not necessarily that long-lived, like Mace Windu, to talk about the history of the Jedi or to talk about what has happened to the Jedi Order across, you know, decades and centuries and things, if 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we went to write this book, there wouldn't have been the specificity of the High Republic era established yet. So you wouldn't really have been able to dig into it with a ton of specificity. But
Right.
we can now. And so the whole adventure hinges on, them visiting a place that Jedi had visited once before, centuries earlier, and that place has changed over the centuries in the same way that the Jedi Order has changed. And how do the Jedi reckon with that as individuals, reckon with that as an order, and reckon with that with the people who are living right in front of them in this place? And it's really cool to be able to play with that. It was so much fun to be able to echo to that and to have the Jedi, both young and old. There are young Jedi like Depa Billaba and Obi-Wan in this story, and there are also very old Jedi like Oppo Rancisis and Yoda and Yarael Poof. And so to get to play with all of that history, both individual and collective, was so much fun and really made for, I think, really gave a ton of dimension to a really fun adventure that John Jackson Miller, the author, put together. Um,
I guess in the
so,
Phantom Menace, you kind of look at the Jedi Council and you just see, well, at least Anakin sees, he just sees one faceless, just body of people. But they're really so much more than that. They're all individuals and they all have
exactly.
different.
And in the Phantom Menace, we hear like three or four of them really speak, right? And most of that is carried by Yoda and Mace Windu. But there are 12 of them there, and they all have opinions, and they all have relationships with each other, and some of them would agree with each other at some times and don't agree, and they all have also opinions and views on the role the Jedi serve in the galaxy and the role the Jedi serve in relation to the Republic. And so we get to put all of those people in a bowl and shake it up and get to see what comes out of that in this book. And um, that was so much fun to do and so much fun to explore. And I was talking about Oliver having a real challenge to get all these Jedi on a book cover, handing that challenge to John and say, "Hey, John Jugs Miller, I need you to get all of these Jedi and all of their distinct personalities and distinct opinions and distinct characteristics into a single book." Was a similar challenge that, much like Oliver, John Jackson Miller just came through immediately, which was like, ah, I got it, here it is, and just like immediately had a way to do it and a plan and a story that allowed us to um, take advantage of all of that, which again, super exciting, and as an editor is
Beautiful
super
to see it all come
rewarding.
together, I guess.
Exactly. I love it when a plan comes together. Love it.
Uh, So, lastly, kind of tying into that is what's the most rewarding aspect of working on the franchise? Is there anything that you hope people take
Oof.
away from everything that you do? I know it's a very broad question, but
Um, the most rewarding thing is is kind of two things that are two sides of the same coin, and it comes down to getting to have relationships and to have conversations and to connect with the people who are connected to the franchise. And in one part of that is I have the immense privilege to be able to work with all of these amazing creative people, my colleagues, uh, the authors that we bring in, all of the people who come together to put the books together, to work on the books, my colleagues and friends at Lucasfilm. Like, I have this immense privilege of getting to work with all of these people and for all of us to sit around and make contributions to Star Wars and to see all of the different ways that everyone's connections and love and joys for Star Wars come alive in these books that we collaborate on together. And to be able to go to an author who, I know has cared about and had been connected to Star Wars in the way that, so many other people are and say, "Hey, would you like to come make a book with us? Would you like to come make a Star Wars story with us?" Being able to do that is just like this amazing, rewarding, unique privilege that I never have taken for granted and never will, and is just remarkable. But the other side of that, the other side of that coin, and the other side of that connection is like that is just as rewarding, if not more so, is like I get to spend a lot of time connected with people who read books, who read the books that, I have made like a small contribution to, who read the books that, I have, made played a small role in help getting to the bookshelf or the world for them to read, and getting to connect with people and hear from people what stories have mattered to them, the characters that have mattered to them, the moments in books that like they still remember years later, the copies of their books that are either all dog-eared from being read so many times or have a million intricately organized and beautiful colored post-it notes because they've marked almost every page with like a quote or an event or like some other moment in a book that they want to, chronicle and remember. And so being able to do that and connect with them, whether that's through social media or going to conventions or going to Star Wars Celebration or just kind of randomly out in the world from time to time, as ridiculous as that kind of sounds, that's like the most rewarding thing because I started as a reader and I wanted to be the reason why I wanted to do any of this was because I was a reader of all of these books. Grew up reading all these books and just said like I enjoy reading these books so much and I enjoy being part of a particular community so much that I want to contribute to that even more. And so that's why I became a book editor and a Star Wars book editor. And so now being able to then go back into the community that I come from and talk to people about these books in the same way and connect with them over them is just, that's the most rewarding thing. That's the best part of it. It's the best part every single time. That and then getting to work with all the different authors. It's as good as it gets. It's so much fun. And like I said, it's like one of those privileges that I just like think about. I think about all the time, and I think about how special it is. And I try never to take it for granted, even on the nights when I might be up really late doing some editing work and the deadlines are getting tight, and I'm like, oh my God, I wish we had more time. I just am like, dude, just remember how incredible this is. And then I do, and then make it happen, which is its own reward and its own bit of fun. But I think that's probably it. Because people are cool and Star Wars readers are cool, and getting to hear from people what books really resonated with them is amazing, and what parts of books, particularly because every book that I work on, there's always like one or two things I'm like, oh man, I bet you people are going to really like X, or I bet you this character, I'm really excited. I think people are going to really like this character. And while a lot of times that is true, kind of much like anything else, Star Wars or otherwise, there's always like when people start reading or watching or playing a thing, you're just like, the things you see bubble up to the surface where people are like, wow, everyone's really into that thing. I never would have guessed that. That's
It's
also
really
like,
obscure little just
yeah,
pull.
this guy who's on screen for 2 seconds, everyone seems real obsessed with him. And that's really rewarding and interesting as well because it just gives you another insight into the way that we people experience this. I'm not going to spoil who or what it is, but there's actually a character in the Living Force who fits that bill. They are described for about 2 sentences and they say their name. I think they have one other line of dialogue, and otherwise they don't really play that. That's it. That's their real most exposure. And among people, folks who already have the book, like reviewers and things like that, I have already gotten a bunch of messages from people who are like obsessed with this character, and I'm just like, I had no idea that people would be,
That would
that.
be such a big
Yeah,
thing.
exactly. But that's really cool, and I'm super excited, and like, like that's awesome. I'm so excited by that because I could never have imagined that, right? It would only came from talking to people and talking from people who had experienced the book to know that that had resonated with them. So, yeah, that never gets old. It's just the whole community of Star Wars readers just never gets old. It never gets taken for granted. That's it. That's the answer.
So, thank you so much for sitting down with us. Wikipedia really appreciates all of your work, and we use a lot of like Essential Reads Companion all the time. But even a lot of your like modern work with the new canon, it's phenomenal. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate that. I appreciate all of the work folks at Wikipedia do. I appreciate all the 19 iterations of like book covers that get stored on there. That's really cool. It's helping to kind of keep the archive of, particularly for Star Wars publishing and books and things, like keeping that alive. I apologize for editing my own Wikipedia page a bunch of times. Apparently not supposed to do that, and I did. But I like to edit it from time to time with very truthful things. Mostly because I can still imagine the like first times I found out about Wikipedia, and I'm like, I still find it a little odd that there is a Wikipedia page for me. So every once in a while, I feel the need to like go in there and just be like, I just need to add a weird sentence to this because it's going to make me feel better about the fact that this page
It
exists and
may
all.
get edited with some of the content from this interview, so we shall see.
Oh, cool. Well, for anyone who wants to add, I cannot ride a bike. So if someone wants to add that, you now have a source where you can
That
source.
would be very helpful.
So
Yes, thank you.
cannot ride a bike. Also allergic to some kind of tree, but I don't know which one. So there you go. All right.
All right. Well, thank you very much,
You're
and
very welcome.